So thank you organizers for giving this opportunity to discuss important developments in multiple myeloma in this forum. And we'll try to discuss on the in line with the theme of the conference, the breakthrough in multiple myeloma, through five important points. Next slide, please. So I'm really fortunate to have a spectrum of panelists. Dr. Prashant Ganeshan is additional professor and consultant medical oncologist at Department of Medical Oncology, JIPMER, Puducherry. Next slide, please. I have Dr. Hasmukh Jain. He is colleague at TMH. So he's a associate professor and consultant medical oncologist again in medical oncology department at TMH Mumbai with me. Next slide, please. I have Dr. Deepa Philip. She was our formal colleague here in TMH. After spending some years in TMH, she moved on to RCC Trivandrum. So now she is a consultant in medical oncology there at RCC Trivandrum. Next slide, please. We have Nidhi Tandon, again our former colleague at TMH. Now she is a consultant medical oncologist at Majumdar Shaw Medical Center and NH Bangalore. Next slide, please. And finally, we have Dr. Vijit Shetty. He's associate professor and medical oncologist at the KS Hegde Medical Academy, Mangalore. So thank you all the panelists for joining, and we'll try and sort of cover important five aspects in multiple myeloma development, which hopefully, in my opinion, qualifies for a breakthrough. Next slide, please. Next, please. So first point I would like to discuss is the induction regimen. So we have seen a sea of change in the induction regimen which we use now in our clinical practice, and this probably is the first and beginning point where we started things moving for the first time in multiple myeloma, mainly thanks to the novel agent. So I would just like to have feel of our panelists what a common induction regimen they use at their center and how do they choose on that. Next slide, please. So we can have everyone telling their views. Dr. Prashant, what's your practice at JIPMER?
At JIPMER, we generally start induction regimen with BRD triplet for a person who is eligible and who is otherwise in good general condition. We practice the VRD both for transplant eligible as well as transplant ineligible patients in general. Somebody who is very elderly and who is not very fit, we may do either a VD or a lenalidomide dexamethasone. Having said that, this is the standard. In the occasional patient whom we feel is very high risk based on cytogenetics or other parameters, and if you can afford it, we would consider giving a quadruplet with addition of daratumumab. But that would be a very rare patient in our kind of treatment setting.
Yeah. Maybe we can get opinion from Nidhi. She practices in a different setting, a private practice. So, Dr. Nidhi, what's your practice?
I think I agree with what Dr. Prashant said. After looking at the transplant eligibility, it will be generally as if the patient is not frail or do not have comorbidities, then VRD is usually the treatment of choice in young and very high risk cytogenetic. Quadruplet with the DERA can be used.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Deepa, what's your choice at RCC Trivandrum, and how do you decide on individual patient? Let's see, someone is high risk versus a low risk patient, and transplant eligible versus non-eligible.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, Deepa, you are audible.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Bhausab sir and the organizers. Well, I would say that it's all about three hopes. For me, it's a hope, it's an honor, it's an opportunity, a privilege and experience. And I sincerely hope that it's not a hardship, ordeal and punishment in the evening for you all. So the journey of myeloma is truly like running a marathon, and it's not about a sprint. And the journey of 1,000 miles, it begins with a single step. Fortunately, in the therapeutic armamentarium against myeloma, we have over 20 new weapons which have been added in the last 2 decades. So from this long menu, what do we order for the next patient who walks into my clinic? I take this decision based on 3 E's. The first E is what we all know, that is what the evidence tells us. The second E that is very important is the experience of the oncologist, what drug we are comfortable using. Third and most important E is the expectation of the patient, that is, the perception of the patient, the cost factor and the convenience of the patient. So in a newly diagnosed patient of multiple myeloma, I look at 3S. The first S is, as we all know, a symptomatic myeloma who is fulfilling the SLIP-CRAB criteria. Second is based on the staging and the stratification of risk, as sir has already said, a standard risk versus a high risk. Third is the stem cell transplant eligibility. So with this 3E and the 3S, I have a clear algorithm in my mind that I have two categories of patients. One is a group that is transplant eligible. Second is a group that is transplant ineligible. In a transplant eligible group, the aim is of course to get a deep and better response with an adequate stem cell harvest. And I know, we all know, that a triplet is better than a doublet. For the induction, I would choose a combination regimen with drugs from different classes, preferably with non-overlapping toxicity. So I would use a steroid with a proteasome inhibitor plus an IMiD or an alkylator. So my first choice would be, as we all said, it would be RVD, where I would use bortezomib subcutaneous weekly, dexamethasone 40 milligram weekly with lenalidomide. And in patients with renal concern, I would go for VCD. With after 4 to 6 cycles of this induction regimen, go for consolidation with transplant followed by maintenance. On the contrary, in a transplant ineligible group, my aim would be a little different. It will be not just to add days to the life, it's equally important to add life to the days of the patient. So I would stage the myeloma, along with that I would stage the age of the patient, apply appropriate frailty assessment tools, and all these tools finally melts down to 5 M's. The first M is a cognition, that is the mind. Second is the morbidities. Third M is the mobility, that is the activities of daily living. Fourth M is malnutrition. Fifth M, which is most important in our setting, is man and means, that is the socio-economic factors. Based on this, if I have a fit patient, I would go for a triplet or maybe a doublet. In a frail patient, I would go for a slow go strategy, maybe an RVD light, or maybe I would go for a completely oral protocol, especially in the present COVID times, with lenalidomide dexa, or maybe an oral protocol like MPT or CTD. There I would go for maybe 8 to 12 cycles to get a best response with a good tolerance and then go for maintenance. So that is what I would do in a transplant ineligible group.
Yeah, I think Deepa very well summarized. I don't think I came across anything better than this algorithm which you have in your mind. Thank you very much. You answered almost all the question. Just to ask everyone, does this improvement in the induction qualifies as a breakthrough? This was to give an idea to our patients. Is how do you tell how much we are going to gain if you are using novel agent-based induction in terms of maybe PFS or overall survival approximate figure? Yeah, anyone can that. Am I audible?
You're audible, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think in a particular high risk subset, see, this is just based on one study at this point of time, right? So there are older studies just using VRD as induction or VTD as induction, followed by an autologous transplant, followed by something like a bortezomib based maintenance. And even those studies have shown median survival of up to 8 years in even patients with 17p deletion. So if you use a strategy which involves a bortezomib based consolidation, you're probably going to get a very decent result. In those studies, actually, some of the 17p deletions, those patients did not do very well. So if you are choosing those kind of patients, probably the other risk factors, somebody probably has some circulating plasma cells or a high LDH. So these are all not fully factored in. If you have all these things going on and the patient can afford daratumumab, why not offer to him? Because at least one study has shown a reasonably good PFS advantage. Going to the specific question that you are asking, how much extra PFS benefit daratumumab would give in a patient with a high risk disease, I'm not able to quantify. But my guess is at least, I mean, in a median, probably you're looking at probably least 6 to 12 months of extra gain. That's my guess, but I may be wrong.
Fair enough. I think you told us the whole story, and just to point I was trying to raise was that by adding this novel agent like bortezomib or lenalidomide, each drug led to a 10 to 12-month improvement in the overall survival. And if you use the triplet, this has definitely added years together to the life of patient. And I think all of our patient, if they are eligible for receiving this drug, should be receiving them, and we should be moving away from the traditional cytotoxic drug. We'll move on to next slide, and we have some. I think Deepa has covered everything. Yes, she has covered the frail patient. Just one yes or no. Would you like to use second generation PI or pomalidomide, second generation IMID in the induction regimen in newly diagnosed patient?
About carfilzomib, again, as far as evidence goes, NCCN it's a category 1 recommendation. But we have the long endured and long awaited endurance trial from ASCO 2020, where KRD was compared with RVD, which was a phase 3 randomized control trial. There was better responses, deeper responses, but that did not translate to a PFS or OS benefit. There was increased cardiopulmonary and renal side effects, but that was in a group which did not include non-high risk patients and patients who were not planned for an upfront transplant. That is a usual patient profile.
Yeah, so do I, you say no to that, Deepa?
No, sir, but from the experience, like if you have a patient who is a high risk, like a triple hit or a double hit, maybe a patient who has upfront significant neuropathy, on a case-to-case basis, balancing with the expectation whether it is worth the price for the hope that we give them, maybe in a high-risk situation, but in a routine patient, non-transplant eligible, standard risk patient, I would not use it. And for pomalidomide, the evidence is for the relapse refractory setting and not in the induction setting.
Yeah, so correct. Both of these drugs in a garden variety patient have not been shown to benefit, and we could choose from a case to case depending upon advantage of this drug. But as of now, we don't use them. So that's a good thing that saves cost for our patient and something to use in next line. We'll move on to next breakthrough, which in my opinion is a real breakthrough. Next slide, please. And that's response assessment. So if you go back to 2010 International Myeloma Working Group response assessment criteria, they were not read by even physicians. They were responses were not there. So now, as we have deeper responses, the criteria have evolved, and now we are looking into it. So how frequently do you do response assessment? Do you do all these tests, or you cut short, and do you practice doing bone marrow or PET scan? Prashant, your practice?
In my practice, I think when you start a patient of myeloma on treatment, within 1 month, if your hemoglobin is going up, the patient's symptoms are coming down, you already know he is responding. So I'm not really pushing for all these investigations every month as it's shown in some of the guidelines. So what I generally do is I probably do serum electrophoresis 2 months down the line to know that things are going well. It's a transplant eligible patient. I'm taking him for transplant after 4 cycles. I will do a proper evaluation at the end of 4 cycles. I'll get an electrophoresis, probably an SFLC, because we need to know the depth of the response for long-term outcomes. So we do that. PET scan we do probably earlier as part of a study. Now we do it because we have it again on a protocol we want to know. So we are continuing to do PET scan for patients before the transplant to know the depth of response. Again, MRD assessment as part of protocol we are doing, not as part of our routine care. So for routine care, I would just say electrophoresis is good enough for most patients. SFLC, I do it in patients who have light chain myeloma or in those who are just going to go for a transplant to know the depth of response. That's all. And bone marrow just before the transplant. Otherwise, I don't do routinely bone marrows.
Yeah. So I think that's our practice at TMH also. Does anyone have anything differing from this? No. So I think we'll move on to the next point in the myeloma maintenance, myeloma treatment, and that's on stem cell transplant. Next slide, please. So I'd like to have opinion from Vijit. This is a question which comes repeatedly. Do we still need to do transplant? It was started in late 1980s. Now we have more potent drugs. We have a second generation of same drugs. We have newer molecules. We have monoclonal antibodies. So I would like to ask you, what do you do in your practice? Do you still do transplant, or you defer it in cases?
Yeah, actually, thanks for that question, Dr. Bausab. So we still do transplants in spite of having newer agents like daratumumab, which have increased the response rate or MRD negativity. which is actually not, we're not doing that on a practical basis. But still, I feel transplant is not out yet. We still do it for all the high risk myelomas and in the standard risk myelomas, wherever the transplant, it is transplant eligible. So I don't think it has gone out of the window yet. We still do it for almost all our patients who are eligible for stem cell transplant.
Yeah, do you differ in some patient? Maybe you collect cells and want to do it at the time of relapse. Any situation where you do that?
Yeah, so as far as possible, we try to do it in the upfront setting and try to, we give the patient the option. So wherever it is feasible, practically, we try to do it in the upfront setting. And the only reason which I can think of is probably severe logistics to do a transplant upfront. Only in that scenario, probably we ask the patient to get it done at the relapse setting. And with respect to cryopreserving, we are not doing it at present. We are not doing it upfront and then waiting for the relapse to happen and then do the stem cell transplant. So when the patient relapses at that point of time, probably we give them a regimen which puts them into remission and then we do the stem cell
Yeah, I
collection.
think that's a major reason for pushing transplant upfront, because cryopreservation facilities are really not available. And I think our patients' mentality to undergo transplant at relapse goes down even further. But point well taken. As of now, despite having so many advantages, probably transplant remains a part of treatment paradigm, as shown in this VRD induction studies, though it continues to show its benefit. Quick comment about your role, your comment on the tandem transplant and allo transplant. Yes, no,
Yeah.
and
So,
can.
so actually, tandem transplant, we're not offering our patients, like, if the theoretical consideration would be someone with a deletion 17p or a high risk cytogenetics, where we would do we were supposed to counsel the patient for a tandem transplant, but we are not offering it for our patients at present. Uh, uh, I would like to get other panelists' opinion
Yes,
also
I
there.
think that's interesting, because you highlighted the point of high-risk patient benefiting by tandem transplant, and the EMN02 study clearly shows that. So European offers for high-risk patients. So what's your take, Prashant, Deepa, and Nidhi?
We don't routinely do tandem transplants. We do discuss it every time in our boards, but I think practically it's very difficult to offer two transplants in our setting. So routinely, I don't remember we offering any patient this transplant twice in myeloma.
Yeah. Any
We
different?
also routinely do not practice tandem transplant except maybe a patient with extensive extramedullary disease, or the one who has not achieved a deep a CR even after transplant, but generally it is not practiced.
Yeah, I think there are points for both doing tandem and not doing. So, for example, the European study showed a benefit of tandem, but the American stamina failed to show. So, if you are using VRD induction, probably the benefit of tandem transplant went down. So, point well taken. We don't practice as of now, but definitely a high risk patient where you are not given a really intensive induction and you have suboptimal response, maybe you could think of that. We'll move on to next part. Next slide, please. And so we covered all these points. Next slide, please. Maintenance therapy. So next slide, please. So I would like to see the practices. Means, do we do maintenance therapy for all patients, transplant eligible and non-eligible, and what's the agent of choice and duration? So we'll start with Dr. Nidhi.
I prefer to use maintenance in both transplant eligible and non-eligible patients in standard risk cytogenetics lenalidomide, and in high risk cytogenetics bortezomib based maintenance is what I try to follow.
Okay. Anyone, any difference as far as agents concerned?
I agree that if it's a standard risk, lenalidomide is the easiest to do, and high risk patients can be offered both.
Yeah, so do you think we should be combining lenalidomide with bortezomib in high-risk patient, or use bortezomib alone?
Mostly we use bortezomib alone. I think there is some data for triplet maintenance in some studies, but not part of a routine practice. I don't know.
Correct.
What do you do in
Yeah,
Tata? Do you use triplet
Prashant, I
maintenance?
think you nailed it. Surprisingly, there is no data for randomized data for proteasome based maintenance. Despite we practice it in high risk patient and people kind of combine it with, but there is little data on high risk patient population, and this is surprising. People do studies for new drug, but for such a thing which has been shown to have not only overall survival but a PFS and overall survival benefit in terms of years together, there are inadequate studies. Given the benefit, I think we at TMH routinely use lenalidomide maintenance for all the patients, transplant eligible and ineligible, and we try and combine proteasome and IMID for high risk patients. So we move on to the next theme, and that's next slide, please. Uh, that's on the minimal residual disease. This is not a treatment modality. This is just a test. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to have opinion of everything. What do you think? MRD as is being projected as a promising modality in terms of its prognostic ability, its ability to overcome the baseline risk factors, its ability to predict patient's outcome and hence decide on treatment. Do you think is it as promising as it is being projected? I will start with Prashant.
I would say that currently MRD is a tool for prognosis. It's fairly well accepted, and there is fair amount of data to show that somebody who achieves an MRD negative status, uh, and most of the data is flow based MRD, and the cutoff is 10 raised to 5. So if you achieve that level of MRD, it correlates with long-term progression-free survival and some data on overall survival also. So this is the current status. But other than that, currently there is no strategy for using the MRD for tailoring therapy. So we do not have any data for that. So that's where it stays at this point of time. So it's not coming to routine practice because it's not changing therapy. At our center, it's done as part of a study. We do not use that information for any tailoring of therapy or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's nicely submitted by Prashant. Anyone has any differing opinion on this? Do they use in their clinical practice? Nidhi, you practice in a private setup. Do your patient wants to know MRD? Do they read and ask you to do it?
So, if the patient asks, we can do it, sir, but the impact will be only either prognostic, or if he is a part of a clinical trial, then it can be used as a surrogate endpoint. But otherwise, it is not a predictive marker. As Dr. Prashant just said, it is not going to change therapy in any way.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. We'll have to avoid the three big groups doing their MRD based studies. So, US group doing MRD based study, the IFM 2019, it is deciding based on the MRD level post induction. Definitely interesting thing, but we'll have to wait for it. And since this has been shown to have prognostic value, this probably is a better way of assessing the response. We'll move on to the next and probably the last part of the discussion. Next slide, please. And that's about yeah. This is one quick question to Vijit. Vijit, will you avoid transplant if someone is MRD negative at the end of induction?
I would still offer transplant even if it is MRD negative. If it's eligible, yes, definitely I would.
Yeah, but you have achieved MRD negativity. I think there is nothing left in the bone marrow. What are we getting by giving him 200 milligram of melphalan?
But then, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I would probably still offer.
Yeah. So sorry to ask you that tricky question, but I think the excellent data from Forte shows that even if you achieve MRD negativity, it is not persistent if you don't consolidate. So the persistent MRD negativity is what we want, and we still have to do transplant if someone is MRD negative pre-transplant. We will move on to the monoclonal breakthrough, and I will direct this question to Nidhi. I think she would be using the daratumab maximum as of now. So, Nidhi, in line with our discussion, do you think daratumab qualifies for a next breakthrough in multiple myeloma, and what kind of benefit we expect if we use in a patient upfront?
Absolutely, sir. I consider it to be a big breakthrough in myeloma, because even if PI and IMID refractory patients are getting a OS of 18 to 20 months after 3 lines of therapy, that was unachievable before. So, as regards to using it in newly diagnosed. Now we have enough data in transplant eligible as well as ineligible patients of using it in with combination in whether it is VMP or RD in ineligible patients or with VTD in transplant eligible patients, that it increases the progression free survival and deepens the response.
Yeah, thank you. But given the cost, Nidhi, we want to use it as minimal as possible with the maximum benefit. Okay, so according to you, what should be the best time to use it? Upfront, first line, or second line, or maybe later after that?
So, uh, though in the trials we found that standard risk patients had a lower benefit than high risk cytogenetics patients in newly diagnosed setting, but when the meta-analysis was done, it was found that high risk cytogenetic patients also achieved a PFS of a hazard ratio of PFS of around 0.6 with the use of addition of daratumumab. So young patient, high risk cytogenetics, I would still consider using daratumumab in upfront settings if affordability is not the issue. Otherwise, in the relapsed refractory setting.
Yeah, but the argument is all the upfront trial, they gave daratumab to one arm and they did not have a kind of daratumab being given to the control arm at the time of relapse. So you are using 4-drug versus a 3-drug design. Is it a fair design to do in all these upfront daratumab trials? Means it obviously is going to show a PFS benefit, but do you think we could do the same thing at the time of relapse and achieve same benefit, or you lose the opportunity to use the drug?
So, sir, the in the preclinical scenario, it was found that the IMiD when we give IMiDs and the immunomodulation which happens with IMiDs, that has a synergistic effect with daratumumab. So, I don't think it is only because of using a quadruplet versus a triplet regimen. Daratumumab must be having some additional benefit using it in induction, but of course, as you told, those patients did not receive daratumumab later on, and that is of course a discrepancy. But I still believe that there is an additional benefit considering there is synergistic activity with the immunomodulators and daratumumab for sure.
Yeah, so you're pointing that the immune microenvironment is preserved and immune modulation probably would be best active in the first line setting.
Yes.
Yeah, anyone wants to comment anything? So now the next slide, please. And I think there is an issue with the cost with this drug. Okay, and
the only other thing is that the mechanism of resistance is till now what has been found is CD38 depletion. So that is something I'm not sure. Like if the patient has used upfront daratumumab and using it in relapsed refractory setting, that would be something which we would have to look about, sir.
Yeah, I think the story is evolving. There is data that patient treated with another CD38 targeted antibody or another way, they have lesser responses at the time of relapse. One concern thing, which is kind of a practical issue, is tolerance in the latter line of therapy. Many of them, these patients develop pneumonia, etc. So this is definitely a good option. As of now, it is costly, but hopefully in coming future we'll have a good outcome with this. I think we have covered all the 5 points. Next slide, please. So I will like to conclude, and I hope that all my panelists agree that novel agent-based induction is a must, and it gives you a advantage in terms of PFS and overall survival in years. Autologous stem cell transplant is helpful even today's situation. Maintenance therapy, definitely it gives you a easier way to treat your patient and postpone the relapse, but also has a survival advantage in terms of months to years. MRD upcoming data, hopefully one day we'll be able to tailor our patients treatment based on their minimal residual disease assessment. And immunotherapy, as we saw in the last, is changing the way we are treating multiple myeloma, and hopefully we will also access to it in the next future. Next slide, please. So with this, I thank all my panelists and all of you for hearing, and the organizers for giving me opportunity. So over to you, sir.